The night my father said those words, my body went completely still, before my mind could recognize how much damage a single sentence could cause. My name is Haley, and I was 27 years old when I realized that even families that look stable from the outside can destroy you without warning. Until that moment, I truly believed that blood meant protection and that silence meant peace. But I was wrong in a way that felt permanent. I walked into the living room expecting a short conversation about responsibilities schedules or things that did not matter enough to change the shape of my life. Instead, the air felt controlled and calculated, as if the room itself had already decided that I did not belong. Dad looked at me and said, "In this family, you no longer matter." My chest tightened immediately while my body froze in place because my instincts understood the threat before my thoughts had time to react. I looked at him and said, "Say that again?" Slowly. Dad did not hesitate, and he did not show emotion because he had already decided that he did not need to soften the impact. He said, "You heard me. We are done pretending you are important here." There was no anger in his voice, and there was no hesitation in his tone. That calm delivery made the words heavier, because quiet cruelty does not give you space to fight back or room to defend yourself. In that silence, I felt something inside me shift without consent. My position in that family was not debated or discussed. It was erased in a way that felt organized and final. From that moment forward, I stopped trusting the space I had once called home. I stopped believing that loyalty would protect me or that effort would make me visible. From that exact moment, I stopped giving them my time, my attention, and my resources because I understood that nothing I gave would ever be enough. And just a few days later, they begged me to come back. But I refused. Be honest, if your own family said this to you, would you fight to stay or choose to leave? And how do you think that choice would change your future? Comment your answer. That night, the house did not look different at first glance, but the familiar sense of belonging dissolved quietly as I moved through each room and felt a resistance that had never existed before. Every step felt slightly misplaced. Every small sound carried a weight that did not announce itself openly, and the air around me held a tension that made even simple movements feel like I was crossing a boundary that no one wanted to explain. I tried to keep my normal routines because structure felt safer than confrontation, yet the way people responded to my presence shifted in small but undeniable ways that made silence feel louder than past arguments. Voices softened when I walked into shared spaces, eye contact disappeared right before it could settle, and rooms that used to feel open began to feel like territory. I was only allowed to borrow for short moments. I kept sitting in the same chair even when it no longer felt like it belonged to me. My stepmother, Diane Monroe, began adjusting small things around the house in a way that felt measured rather than helpful, and after that moment, I referred to her only as Diane. She moved items I used daily to places I would not expect, changed shared schedules without mentioning them to me, and corrected small habits with a calm authority that left no space for discussion. Nothing she did looked dramatic from the outside, yet the consistency of it all carried an intention that slowly became heavier with time. My younger brother, Ethan Monroe, started pulling away in a manner that felt deliberate instead of emotional, and from that point forward I thought of him only as Ethan. He stopped meeting my eyes in narrow hallways, avoided sitting near me at meals, and found quiet reasons to leave a room whenever I entered, which made the silence between us feel calculated rather than natural. He never said anything unkind, yet the distance grew in a way that felt practiced over time. Instead of reacting, I shifted my focus toward observation and quiet understanding, because reacting would have given them control over the atmosphere, while watching allowed me to remain steady in a place that was becoming strategic. I began to notice timing instead of tone placement, instead of intention, and patterns instead of apologies, which allowed me to build awareness without exposing confusion. I memorized the way quick glances moved when my name was mentioned, the small delay before responses came when I spoke, and the way silence gathered when I remained in a room slightly too long. A subtle sense of something hidden began to form behind their behavior, and it felt less connected to me than to something urgent that I could not yet define. Papers stopped appearing in shared areas where they used to be left. Casually, doors stayed closed longer than usual without clear reasons, and conversations ended abruptly when footsteps approached, which created a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I chose not to confront anyone in that moment because I was no longer trying to be understood, and asking questions felt less useful than watching quietly. By the end of that night, I understood that I was no longer part of the emotional rhythm of the house, not because I had failed in any way, but because the structure of attention had shifted without warning or consent. I did not cry or raise my voice or demand explanations, because I sensed that answers would not come freely, and forcing them would only give me softer lies instead of hard truth. I remained still in my own space and watched people slowly adjust to a version of the house where my presence was no longer treated as something central or necessary. 3 days later, the silence felt organized. By the third morning, the routine inside the house shifted into something colder and more deliberate. Dad moved through shared spaces without looking at me, not in anger or irritation, but in a way that felt practiced, as if my presence no longer required direct acknowledgement. When he spoke, his words aimed past me instead of at me, short exchanges about schedules, groceries, or work that never included my opinion or my input. I noticed how his chair turned slightly away from me at the table, not by accident, but through small repeated movements that became part of the structure of the room. That same afternoon, I walked into the living area and realized my personal items were missing. The books I kept by the armchair were gone. The throw blanket I used every evening no longer rested on the couch. Even the small ceramic mug I always used had disappeared from the kitchen cabinet. Diane did not mention the changes, did not ask permission, did not explain the reason, and when I looked at the cleared spaces, I understood the message without needing words. The house was becoming a place where my presence was temporary, even though my name remained on the family responsibilities. I tested small decisions to see what was still mine to control. I adjusted the thermostat once, and noticed it returned to its previous setting within minutes. I moved a chair in the dining area and found it placed back into alignment later that night. I changed the position of a lamp in the hallway and watched it disappear entirely by morning. These were not arguments. There were no raised voices. It was quieter than that. It was systematic. During dinner on the third evening, I attempted to join a conversation about weekend plans. Dad did not respond to my question. Diane answered as if I had not spoken, describing arrangements that did not include me without hesitation. I watched the way Ethan avoided the edges of my sight, how his fork moved slower whenever I spoke, how he stared at his plate rather than risk eye contact. I felt the absence of direct hostility, which was more unsettling than any open conflict, because it meant the decision about my place had already been finalized by someone other than me. Later that night, while walking past the home office, I noticed a stack of unopened mail on the corner of the desk. One envelope sat slightly apart from the others, folded in a way that looked hurried. Inside were notices that did not belong to me, statements related to overdue balances, a warning about upcoming deadlines, a letter with bold phrases about account reviews and payment schedules. I did not open everything. I did not need to. The pattern stood out immediately because stress leaves fingerprints even when people believe they have hidden it well. I placed the papers back exactly where they were without disturbing their alignment, but the weight of what I had seen did not leave me. I started connecting small details, whispered phone calls cut short when I walked into a room late night, typing sounds from behind closed doors, conversations that stopped mid-sentence whenever I approached. No one was trying to scare me. No one wanted confrontation. They were trying to keep control while pretending the structure still held. That realization settled deeper than fear. I was not losing a place in the family by accident. The system was being redesigned quietly. I could feel the edges of the new structure forming around me, tightening in a way that left no space for negotiation. I stopped trying to fix anything. I stopped asking where I fit. I started watching what they protected, what they hid, and what they feared becoming visible. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt engineered. A week passed without arguments, only rearrangements. I started to pull myself out of every unnecessary interaction with the people inside that house, not because I felt weak, but because I realized that observation required distance, silence, discipline, and emotional control that I had never practiced before that moment. I stopped offering opinions. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped correcting misunderstandings. Instead, I watched patterns, tracked reactions, measured pauses in conversations, and memorized how each person behaved when they thought I was no longer paying attention. This shift did not feel dramatic, but it felt deliberate, like stepping back from a burning surface before the damage became visible on my skin. My focus moved away from the idea of repairing anything that had already been damaged. Work became my primary structure, not as an escape, but as a place where outcomes were honest, rules were consistent, and effort created visible results. I stayed longer after closing hours. I volunteered for tasks that others avoided. I listened more during meetings and spoke only when I knew my words would not be dismissed. For the first time in a long while, I felt that my presence had a measurable value somewhere, even if it was not inside the walls of my own home. While organizing old folders on my laptop, I began noticing transactions that had once felt insignificant. Small transfers became large when placed in a timeline. Occasional contributions turned into a pattern of consistent support. I saw records of shared bills, emergency payments, quiet deposits, and expenses that I had never calculated as part of my burden because I had been told that everyone was carrying equal weight. The numbers told a different story. The quiet sacrifices told a different story. The silence around those sacrifices finally started to make sense. I opened a private notebook and began writing down everything that belonged only to me. Account details, access codes, forgotten passwords, employment benefits that had never been explained clearly, legal documents that sat untouched in shared drawers. I tracked the flow of money. I analyzed spending patterns. I created order where chaos had once been acceptable. This was not about revenge. This was about clarity. For the first time, I knew exactly where I stood, financially, mentally, and structurally inside my own life. During that week, I met with my best friend, Natalie Brooks. She listened without interrupting, without offering dramatic solutions, without pushing me toward decisions I was not ready to make. She did not try to fix me. She did not defend anyone. She simply allowed the space to belong to me for once. That single conversation stayed with me more than any argument ever had because it showed me what calm support looked like without conditions or expectations attached. As the days passed, my internal reaction to the house shifted again. I stopped feeling invisible. I stopped feeling erased. I began feeling detached. Detachment brought clarity. Clarity brought control. Control brought peace that did not depend on approval. I understood that I was no longer moving inside the system they had built for me. I was designing my own structure quietly, privately, without asking permission from anyone who once believed they could write my role for me. I did not confront them. I did not announce changes. I did not demand recognition. I simply became someone they could no longer read easily. That week did not look dramatic from the outside, but internally, it was the week I stopped trying to be understood by people who had already decided I was unnecessary. 2 weeks later, I stopped asking for space and started creating it. I made my first real move quietly without announcements or emotional preparation because I understood that freedom works best when no one has time to interfere. I opened a personal bank account that only carried my name using a different branch, a different email, a different phone number. I did not ask permission. I did not explain. I did not feel guilty. For the first time, something in my life belonged to me completely without shared access, without questions, without silent expectations attached to every dollar that passed through it. After that step, I built a financial plan that belonged only to me. I studied my income in a different way, not as money meant to support a household that no longer respected me, but as a resource I could design a future with. I broke my expenses into categories, tracked them over time, predicted risks, prepared for emergencies. This was not about greed, and it was not about fear. It was about refusing to stay dependent on a system that had already decided I was disposable. I started seeing my time as currency, my skills as leverage, and my energy as something that deserved careful protection. Inside the house, Diane began to change. Her questions became sharper. Her eyes stayed on me, longer, her tone shifted when I walked past. She started asking vague questions about documents, receipts, cards, bank letters that never actually existed. She tried to catch me off guard by asking things in front of others, hoping I would hesitate or expose something without realizing it. I did not react. I did not argue. I did not confirm or deny anything. She had no proof, no access, no authority over what I had already separated. Her suspicion stayed trapped inside her, growing without direction, because power becomes useless when it cannot touch what matters. At work, a new presence slowly entered my daily routine. My coworker Eric Vaughn became part of my environment through projects, meetings, deadlines, shared responsibilities. He was calm in a way that did not demand attention, focused in a way that did not feel threatening. He listened before speaking. He noticed details without making them feel heavy. These interactions did not feel dramatic. They felt stable. For the first time in a long while, I worked beside someone who treated me as capable without needing to prove anything. That simple professionalism changed the way I thought about respect, because it showed me how light it could feel when it was real. As my independence grew, my understanding of family began to change in ways I did not expect. Family stopped meaning shared walls, shared meals, shared history that was used as leverage. I began to think of it as alignment instead of blood, safety instead of obligation, consistency instead of promises spoken only when convenient. I stopped measuring love by sacrifice, because sacrifice had only made me smaller in that house. I started measuring connection by the absence of fear, by the presence of trust, by the feeling that I could exist without shrinking my voice or hiding my impact. By the end of those 2 weeks, I no longer felt like someone waiting to be accepted. I felt like someone designing a structure that no one could quietly dismantle. I spent less time explaining myself. I spent less time defending my decisions. I spent more time building layers around my energy, my finances, my future. It was not visible to anyone watching from the outside, but inside me, something had locked into place. I was no longer asking to be seen. I was deciding who deserved access. 1 month in my name started to matter somewhere else. At work, things shifted in a quiet but measurable way. My supervisor stopped correcting my reports and started forwarding them, which felt small on paper but heavy in meaning, because it was the first time someone trusted my judgment without attaching conditions or reminders. I was given responsibility over a minor internal process, nothing dramatic, nothing public yet. It marked a real change in how I was seen. For the first time in a long while, my value was recorded instead of questioned. At home, the tone shifted for different reasons. Dad began asking questions that sounded casual, but carried a strange weight, mostly about paperwork, billing letters, or documents that needed to be organized. Diane followed his lead soon after, bringing folders into shared spaces and positioning them close enough for me to notice, but not close enough to touch. They did not ask directly for help, but their eyes kept returning to me in a way that felt calculated, like they were measuring how far they could push without admitting they needed me. The financial cracks became harder to ignore as the days moved forward. Unopened envelopes collected in small piles, digital payment reminders appeared on the shared devices longer than usual, and the tone between them shifted from confident to clipped. I did not step in. I did not offer solutions. I stayed where I was, watching how long it would take before they understood what silence actually felt like when it belonged to them. I started noticing how much effort I used to spend keeping everything together, filling gaps nobody ever thanked me for filling. That realization did not make me angry. It made me precise. I began scheduling my time around my own priorities, treating my energy like a limited resource rather than something that existed for family maintenance. Their chaos was no longer something I felt obligated to manage. Moments began to surface where my absence created visible confusion. A missed form here. A misunderstood deadline there. Small operational failures that used to be invisible because I absorbed them quietly. This time, I did nothing except observe how lost they became, without me correcting their mistakes behind closed doors. I felt a strange calm settle into my routine. Not happiness, not revenge, just clarity. The kind that comes when you stop trying to be seen by people who only notice you when their world starts breaking. I understood, without needing proof, that they were finally learning the cost of never valuing the person who held their system together. Then, everything broke without a warning. The first crack showed up in paperwork, not in voices. I noticed unfamiliar envelopes stacked near the entry table marked with bold lettering from financial agencies that did not use friendly language or patient formatting, which immediately told me that whatever happened in this house was now visible to the outside world in a way that could not be controlled. That was when I first learned what Ethan had been hiding. He had accumulated serious credit card debt and personal loans under his own name, with legal documentation that left no space for denial or confusion, because the files carried clear account numbers, original signatures, and repayment terms that had already been violated. I did not confront him because at this stage, observation felt more valuable than reaction. Within days, the house stopped feeling private. Recovery agents started appearing at the front gate, speaking in firm professional tones that stayed just polite enough to remain legal, but cold enough to make the message impossible to ignore. They came with folders, case numbers, and quiet threats of further action, creating a pressure that lived in the air long after they left, which changed the rhythm of the home in a way no argument ever had. Dad felt it before anyone admitted it out loud. He started moving through the house like a guest instead of a figure of authority, avoiding long pauses near unopened mail, avoiding conversations that required decisions, avoiding direct eye contact when certain words were mentioned. I could see the fear settle behind his expression, because the risk was no longer emotional, it was legal and financial, with real consequences tied to property, co-signed obligations, and assets mistakenly placed as guarantees. Diane shifted the most. Her voice softened in ways I had never heard before, losing its usual sharpness and control, replacing orders with questions that sounded unfamiliar inside her own mouth. She started hovering near me whenever the topic of documents came up, carefully choosing phrases that sounded like concern, but carried the weight of desperation just beneath the surface. Eventually, the request came without ceremony. Dad and Diane sat across from me with prepared forms asking me to sign as a financial guarantor to stabilize their collapsing position, explaining that my signature would only be a formality, that it would never truly affect my life, that families were meant to protect each other in moments like this. They spoke slowly, like people trying to step through broken glass without bleeding. I read every line before speaking. I felt no rush, no anger, no satisfaction, because by then my emotions had settled into something colder and clearer. I looked up at them and said calmly, "You said I didn't matter. so I'm not signing anything. No one screamed. No one slammed the table. The silence that followed was heavier than any confrontation, because this time the power did not come from volume, it came from finality. I placed the papers back in their folders, stood up without another word, and walked out of the room, knowing that whatever remained of that system no longer needed my role. 6 months later, quiet no longer felt empty, it felt clean. I moved without telling anyone. There were no goodbyes, no explanations, no forwarded address. I chose a small apartment in a different part of the city, signed the lease, quietly carried my things in 2 trips, then closed the door behind me without ceremony. The silence inside that space felt stable, not lonely, and for the first time in years, it belonged only to me. Life outside their house began to take shape slowly. I changed my routines, walked different streets, learned new grocery stores, built habits that did not depend on anyone's approval. Nothing was dramatic. Nothing was loud. Stability grew in places where chaos had lived before. At the same time, the consequences of their choices kept spreading. The local bank formally withdrew all credit access from their household after missed payments became official defaults. Their long history with that branch meant nothing once the numbers spoke for themselves. Doors that once opened automatically began to stay closed without explanation. Ethan's situation turned legal. A civil lawsuit was filed, properly documented, properly scheduled, and permanently recorded. There were no dramatic scenes. There were no loud confrontations. There was paperwork, filing stamps, formal language, and a calendar that moved forward without emotion. I learned about it only because someone mentioned it casually, as if it were weather. Dad and Diane lost something that could not be measured on paper. Their standing in the community eroded quietly. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations became shorter. Familiar faces began to look away in public spaces. Reputation once cracked did not repair itself. I observed this from a distance without satisfaction, without grief, without involvement. There was no reunion. No late-night phone calls, no apologies, no attempts to reconnect. I did not chase closure because I understood that some doors do not close loudly, they simply stop existing. The quiet I lived in became a tool, not a punishment. I started sleeping without tension in my chest. I stopped checking my phone for messages that never came. I began planning a future that did not include justifying my worth to people who refused to see it. For a long time, I thought strength looked like endurance. I believed survival required silence. I believed loyalty meant tolerating erasure. Somewhere along the way, I learned that strength is sometimes the permission to walk away without permission. I did not go back. I did not look back. I did not wait. Your value is not created by people who benefit from your silence. It is not measured by how much you endure, how much you sacrifice, or how invisible you allow yourself to become. Boundaries are not cruelty. Distance is not betrayal. No one has the authority to define your worth or price your presence in their lives. You are not required to shrink for love, and you are not wrong for choosing peace over familiarity. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. I truly appreciate the time you spent reading it and connecting with it. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you were in this situation, what would you choose to do? Would you leave quietly, like I did, or would you face them directly? Share your perspective in the comments. Your voice matters here.